One of the materials that can be used for construction of base plates is a material which chemically hardens. Actually, it hardens in the presence of a bright light. We call this a visibly light-cured material. Now, as opposed to shellac or wax or one of those materials are thermoplastic, meaning that when you heat them, they become soft. You cool them, they become hard. Well, this material is soft as it comes from the manufacturer, and then after it's cured, it's hard, and you cannot get it to be soft again. So therefore, if we're going to use this on a cast, we have to make sure that once it's adapted to that cast, it can be removed from the cast without fracturing the cast. And the way we do that is by analyzing the cast to see if there are any undercuts that would prohibit us from removing a hardened object from the cast without fracturing the cast. This is best done by the use of an instrument that is known as a surveyor. This is a dental surveyor, and this one happens to be manufactured by the Ney Corporation, so we call it a Ney surveyor. And what this amounts to is a device that allows you, by means of a stylus that comes from a vertical rod like we have here, and a table which is movable. You can put it in any position and then lock it in position like that, or like this, or just perfectly flat, and lock it into position. By putting a cast onto this, securing it to the table, we can analyze whether or not there are any undercuts on this cast. Now, as we observe this cast, we can notice that in relation to the cast being almost horizontal, that if we put something onto that cast, we can see that it is undercut quite radically there. You can see there's quite a bit of undercut there, that if we put something on there that was solid and tried to remove it from that, it would fracture the cast or fracture the object that's on there that's well adapted, that is solid. So something would have to fracture. By changing the angle now of this table, we may be able to find a line of insertion, so to speak, that comes in at an angle other than 90 degrees to the cast that has lessened the amount of the undercut that is on that. And as we can see, when we look at this now, there is far less undercut on it by changing the angle on it than what we had when we had it horizontal to the table. But by changing that angle, we may create undercut in another spot. So we have to go back and look every place and see. There's a very slight bit of undercut posteriorly on this now by changing the angle in the anterior part. So with that undercut that we have posteriorly, that means that we're going to have to apply to this cast some wax right here, along this area, and right here in this area. And that wax is applied so that we can give relief to that cast, so that if we adapt a very solid object onto that cast, it can be removed without fracturing the cast. So the way we eliminate the undercut on it is by taking a number 31 wax spatula, heat it till it's very, very warm, and we're going to, from a wax pencil, get a little wax on the 31 spatula, make sure it's very, very warm, and in the area where we think there's undercut, we are going to apply wax in that area and just smooth it around. So that we think at this point we've eliminated undercut. So we can take it back to the surveyor, and I can see whether or not that has eliminated undercut. Almost, but there's just a little bit of undercut still left in the upper part of this. So I want to flow just a little more wax on it. check it again, and we can see that the undercut has been eliminated now. Now we'll come to another area where there's undercut, and that's up in the labial region. There's just a little bit right there, and it progressively gets a little more as we come around to the central incisor region. So all the way from about here through to the central incisor to the labial frenum, we're going to apply some wax to that area to eliminate undercut. Once we think we have enough wax applied to it, if you get any down into the periphery, you can just take a knife and cut it off and get rid of the stuff that's down in the periphery. And now we check it with the surveyor. You see that the undercut is now eliminated. We want to continue that process around to the other side of the cast now, and we can see that we have undercut from about the canine region through the central incisor region that needs to be eliminated. And posteriorly we have a little undercut way back lateral to the tuberosity. So we're going to flow wax now into the undercut areas in the labial. And a little bit back lateral to the tuberosities. Once that wax has been applied, we're going to come back again with a knife and eliminate that portion that's flowed down into the periphery. But remember, these temporary bases should extend all the way to the depth of the periphery and be as wide as the periphery. And we'll check it with a surveyor, and we see that we still have just a tiny bit of undercut right in the mid portion of that bit of wax we have on the incisal. And the undercut has been eliminated posteriorly. So we just need a little bit more wax in this incisal portion. Now we can see we have eliminated all of the undercut around there. And now, if we make a solid object molded well to this cast, it should be removed without fracturing the cast. The only other thing that you will need to do in order to use a non-thermoplastic type of material is to look at other surfaces, and particularly, let's say, around the rugae area of this maxillary, and we see that there's some little deep grooves involved with it, and all sorts of areas like this. So you want to throw to flow a very, very thin coat of wax over those areas to protect them so that it does not fracture those rugy areas when we attempt to remove it. So this is just flowing a very thin coat of wax over those, not to eliminate undercut, but just to protect those delicate little areas on the cast that might tend to fracture. Now we have the maxillary cast to the point to where we are ready to form a base plate on it out of a material that is not thermoplastic. Now, most often the undercut that we're going to find on a mandibular cast is beneath or lingual to the retromolar pads. There can be undercut in other places, but it's most prominent in most cases lingual to the retromolar pads. And what we find works best in cases like that, where we have extreme undercut lingual to the retromolar pads, is to tilt your cast at an extreme angle, perhaps like that, and this will minimize the amount of material that you have to place lingual to the retromolar pads. So you can see we have a little undercut here lingual to the retromolar pad and a little more on the other side lingual to the retromolar pad. This particular cast, you don't have to eliminate all the undercut with the mandibular, and the reason for that is that the basic shape of a mandibular arch is V-shaped. And it being V-shaped, if you can lift the anterior portion, it will come out in a posterior direction without having to eliminate all of the undercut. So we're going to eliminate a fair amount of undercut on this side and a little bit of undercut on this side, and then that should have it about ready for us to form our base plates. And again, we have a little bit of just little minor grooves in the cast around the labial, so we'll want to put a little wax on those just in these areas where it might be just little tiny little grooves in it that might cause a fracture of the cast. So we're just putting a little bit of wax on those. And now the remainder of it will be lingual to the retromolar pads. So I'm going to start with the patient's right side, and we're going to place a fair amount of wax in that area. And then we're going to place a little wax lingual to the pad on the patient's left side. We don't need near as much on this side as we needed on the other side. The only other thing I worry about in making a non-thermoplastic type of base plate is sometimes when you have a very skinny little sharp-edged ridge such as we have here and a little bit through here, those will tend to fracture on you. So I usually will bulk this up just a little bit through here and here so that the base plate we form will not tend to fracture this ridge off. So we're going to be doing a little bit of bulking of that ridge up as far as the temporary base plate material is concerned. And all we're going to do with this is just flow a little wax right onto that ridge, onto the sides of the ridge. And you don't need a lot there for that, but just enough to protect it. Need just a little to protect the ridge on the left side. And that should be sufficient now to allow us to adapt a non-thermoplastic type of material to that cast to cure it and get it to the point to where it's hard and be able to get that off of the cast without fracturing the cast. Before adapting the Triad material to the master cast to form a base plate, we need to paint the cast with a material known as model release agent. Model release agent is Dent Supply's separating agent, and a brush works pretty good for this. That you paint your cast before adapting the Triad material for the base plate. So we just basically put a light coating onto that cast, and then once that coating is on there, we're ready to adapt the base plate. Now that we have applied a separating medium to the cast, we're now ready to adapt the material to the cast in order to form our trowel base. The material that we use for this type of a base plate is Triad, which is a visible light cured denture base material. And it comes in a package much like the tray material. It's packaged in a black, non-transparent, opaque type package. Because the material itself is visible light cured, it must come packaged like this. So what we do is we open the envelope, retrieve the material from the package. Easier said than done, isn't it? Once we have the material retrieved from the package, it has a plastic sheet on either side of it. So we remove the plastic sheets, position the material over the cast so that we cover all areas, and adapt the material with fingers. Just push it in onto the cast and adapt it very well to the cast, including down into the peripheries. So we push the material, get it down into the peripheries. And once we have it adapted as well as we think we can, like so, one other thing that I like to do is with this material, since it's pliable, you can move the material and mold it. I like to thin the material along the area where I anticipate we're going to be placing teeth. That'll save us a little problem a little later on. As you can see, I'm just thinning the material along there. And this material is plastic enough that we can do that. And once I have it to this shape, now we can cut the excess material from the cast. And if you have an area that you've cut a little too much of the material off, such as right in there, you can take a piece of the scrap material that's left, place it in that area, and just mold it down and let it blend in to the area where it was void. One other thing that we need to do Before curing this material, we need to roughen the area where we want the occlusion rim to be placed onto the base plate, and that is roughly from the crest of the ridge to the periphery, and from about the beginning or the mesial part of the tuberosity, from there, from the crest of the ridge and labial to the crest of the ridge down to the periphery, all the way around from one side to the other. A good way of doing that is just take a knife, roughen the material like so, put some little real rough spots in it. And the rougher you can make this, the better this is going to work. And now this one is ready to be placed into the curing unit and cured until. So for the mandibular, in order to form our base plate with the Triad material, we're again going to paint the model release agent onto the cast. It's hard. We're now ready to adapt the material to the mandibular cast, similar to what we did with the maxillary cast. A few variances as to what we do. So we're going to retrieve the material from the packet. Remember, don't ever open this packet until you're ready to use the material, because this material is visibly light cured, and if you open the packet and pull the material from the packet, it will start to cure some before you're even ready to use it. So don't open the packet until you're ready to use it. So we peel the external surface of film off of it. One thing I like to do with the mandibular that we do not do on the maxillary is, in order to make it better fit the cast, I like to split it in the middle by putting just a cut mark right down the middle, but not coming all the way through. As we can see, it comes from about the posterior 2/3 of this, a cut mark back like that. That allows you to adapt the material without it distorting too much. And now we're going to adapt it to the cast. Now if that material tends to stick to your finger, then a way you can avoid that is just dampen your finger with a little water, and that will keep it from sticking. You may find that, like on this one, we don't have enough material posteriorly. But just like the void that we had when we were doing the maxillary, we can take a little bit of the excess material and fill that void, and it'll be no problem for us to extend it to where it does cover everything. And as you can see, we're slightly shy there of amount of material and a little shy right there. So we're going to cut some excess material off of this. We'll just get rid of the excess material right now and take the excess that we have and adapt the material across the void areas where we didn't have enough material. Just adapt it and push it in, smooth it out with a wet finger. And we can do the same on the other side. Take a small piece of material, adapt it into it until it's nice and smooth. Get rid of all the rest of the excessive material that we might have. Making sure it's well adapted into it. And I'm going to leave a little excess material on the lingual here, because we know that when we get this fully adapted, it may tend to be a little weak in the premolar areas. And by leaving a little excess material and bringing that material up and folding it into it, you can thicken that periphery, make it a little bit stronger than it would be if we did not leave the excess material. And I have a little void right in here, so I'm going to take a little more of the excess material, place it in the area where there's a void or where I might want to thicken it up a little bit, and adapt the material into it, smooth it out nice and smooth, and across the lingual of the anterior is another place where it sometimes tends to be a little weak. We can put a little extra material on that to make it a little thicker, and it will aid in strengthening the material in case we run into a fracture problem, to keep it from getting into the condition of a fracture problem. Again, I like to thin the material where I think the teeth are going to be, which is just labial to the crest of the ridge, and for the posterior teeth right over the crest of the ridge, thin it a little bit. And again, take a knife, and in the areas where we want to adapt wax to it, just make it as rough as you wish. We've got some excess material here I'm going to get rid of. We're going to make the material rough so that when we start adapting wax to it to form our occlusion rim, it will stick to it very easily and won't tend to fracture off or tend to not stick, the wax stick to the visible light cured base plate material. And we see we have a little excess material right there in the front. I'm going to squeeze that up like so. And now this one is ready to cure. Now that we've adapted the material for a base plate to our master cast, we want to paint the external surfaces of that material with the air barrier. And so we just put a nice little coating, very light coating of air barrier onto the external surfaces of it. And then we place it into the oven for 4 minutes and allow the external parts of that to cure for 4 minutes. Once it is cured for 4 minutes, we want to pry the base plate from the cast. We're going to paint the internal surface of it with the air barrier once again. And then we're going to place it back into the oven. And cure it for 4 minutes once again. Now that we've cured internally for 4 minutes with it, at this point we can wash it, scrub it with soap and water, and it's ready to trim the peripheries to form our finished base plate. Again, we paint it with the air barrier on all of the external surfaces. And once it's painted, we place it into the oven. Leave it in the oven for 4 minutes. Now that it's cured, we can remove it from the curing oven, pry it off of the cast, remove it from the cast, Now we're going to paint the internal surfaces of our base plate with the air barrier material. Very light coat of it. Place it back into the oven. And let it cure for 4 minutes. Now that we've cured the base plates, we take a hand piece with a fairly rough, fairly large acrylic burr, and we can trim those, making them nice and neat and smooth across the peripheries and across the posterior. Just getting rid of the excess material and rounding the peripheries. It's important that the entire length and width of the peripheries be left as it was recorded in the impression. If you shorten the peripheries or make them too thin, it will affect the aesthetics of the case that we're doing. Now we have the peripheries pretty smooth on this particular one, so we're going to do the same for the mandibular base plate. Just trim them real nice and neat. After trimming the base plates, we want to place them back onto the master cast, seat them all the way, and see that we have totally filled the periphery, both in length and in thickness of the entire periphery, totally around the entire master cast of those peripheries, that it totally fills that mucobuccal fold both in length and in thickness. And we do the same with the mandibular cast. Place it onto the cast and see that we have filled the periphery both in length and in thickness. At this point we're ready to put an occlusion rim onto the base plates. The occlusion rim is the wax part now that we're going to build up to simulate the position of teeth. I like to start that by taking a hot spatula, and you can use the same number 31 spatula, works real well for it, but get the spatula extremely hot, and in the areas where we're going to place the wax, we were going to scuff it up somewhat with burn marks into that base plate, into the acrylic resin that we made the base plate out of now. We're going to put some burn marks in it to scuff it up and make it real rough so that our occlusion rim that we place on this will stick to it without fear of it coming loose and falling off on us. So just a bunch of real scuff marks that are burned into it with a very hot spatula. Works well for it. I usually put them in several directions like this. Put a few more over onto the other side of this one. And once you get it all scuffed up, take a stick of sticky wax, and we're going to apply a thin coat of sticky wax over those areas now where the scuff marks are. We don't need a lot of it, but just paint on some sticky wax over those areas. And then we can set that aside while we do the same procedure on the mandibular cast. Just some sticky wax over those scuffed areas. Now we're going to take the superheated spatula, very hot spatula, and do the same thing to the mandibular base plate now. Putting scuff marks on it, burn marks into it. And all the areas where that wax is, where our wax for our base plate is going to be, or for the occlusion rim rather, is going to be touching or attached to the base plate. And once we have it scuffed up well, then we're going to apply sticky wax to it once again over the areas where the wax is going to be placed over the base plate. And on the mandibular, that means basically from the crest to the ridge, both buccally and lingually, covering almost everything on the mandibular, from about the distal of where the second molar would be, all the way around, ending at about the second molar area on each side. In other words, about this area on each side. Now, once we have the sticky wax applied to both casts, the next procedure is to make a cylinder of very soft base plate wax. To first of all heat your wax very carefully in an open flame, like so, until the entire sheet of wax is somewhat soft and pliable. Get the entire sheet of wax soft and pliable. Once you do that, then superheat one surface of the wax till it has a molten surface to it, and fold it over, molten surface onto molten surface. And then superheat that part till it has a molten surface, fold that over, and now we can start rolling it. And as you do, you heat it to get a molten surface to it and roll it in such a way that you're always pushing a little pool of molten wax in front of the roll as you roll it. And you keep heating it and pushing that little roll of molten wax in front of it. And you get it down so short, you're going to have to stop and turn it around and go from the other direction with it. For right now, we still work this. And then we can turn it over and work it from here, molten surface, and keep working that molten surface in front of it till you have a hot dog made out of the material. Once you have that, while that material is still soft, you cannot set this material aside and come back to it later. You must continue with it until it is totally adapted and shaped onto your base plate to form your rim. I'd like to square it up somewhat, and as we do, we're lengthening it a little bit and starting to bend it into a horseshoe shape. And once you get it bent into a horseshoe shape, at that point we're going to adapt it to our maxillary cast. So heat the surface that's going to be adapted to it, to the maxillary cast, and I like to start with it in the midline. And in the midline area, push it down onto the cast and let it bend forward at about a 15-degree angle from the occlusal surface, bending forward. Then work it back each side, lengthening it back as you go and pushing it down onto that surface, pushing it all the way down to the buccal on each side, around the labial, doing the same thing, pushing it down. If you get some little cracks in it, don't worry about that. We can take care of that a little later. And then push it down to the periphery and into the palate till it's nice and smooth, and coming all the way down to the palate and going back to about the second molar area. Then examine it, and this labial part should lean forward. So if it is not leaning forward at this point, work the wax and start forming an arch form with the labial portion of it leaning forward at about 10 or 15 degrees from the horizontal plane. So it'll come from the periphery all the way up to the incisal edge in pretty much a straight line and leaning forward 10 to 15 degrees. And start looking at the arch form as you do this. At this point it's a little thin on the occlusal part here, but I'm not worried about that at this point. Look at the arch form. Is it similar to what the arch form of the patient is, of the maxillary arch? Once you have it at this state, heat a spatula, and we're going to sear that in with a hot spatula. We're going to sear it in by just taking a spatula and smoothing it and searing it into the sticky wax and base plate that we made and placed the sticky wax on, and sear it onto it real well so it'll be well attached. You can smooth it somewhat with your spatula as you do that, as you sear it in. Just smooth it and sear it very well. And if there's little voids in it like that, try to melt a little wax and let it flow into it. On the pallet, you want to do the same thing. You want it to be nice and smooth. And sear it into it like so. So you can just take your spatula and let it seal it with a hot spatula. Seal it to the base plate and smooth it as you do. At this point, I look at this and I say, well, it's tall back here and it's maybe not too far from the correct length in the anterior part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the hot plate, and I'm going to heat that hot plate in the flame, in the open flame. And with that hot plate very nice and hot, enough till it will actually shape the wax for us, we're going to smooth it out, and we're going to take a little more off posteriorly than we do anteriorly, at about this level. At this point, we have a nice flat plane on the occlusal surface and incisal edges. It's relatively smooth at this point, but it's a little too long posteriorly. We like to cut this wax off and end this occlusion rim at about 1 centimeter anterior to the hamular notch. And the hamular notch is here, so we want to cut off about 1 centimeter of that at just about that level. And then we can take a spatula and smooth that out where we've made the cut. And one of the beauties of this is if you have a little flaw in your base plate, the external surface of the base plate at this point, you can cover it with wax. Just smoothing it. And again, take about 1 centimeter off, just from anterior to the hamular notch. Then take a warm spatula and smooth everything. Now, at this point, rather than trying to finish it off, that wax is a little bit soft at this point, and it's hard to work with, because it just will tend to run on you if you try to do too much with it while it's this soft. Let's set that aside, and we'll allow that wax now to harden up back to about its original hardness, that what you had at room temperature. And we'll do the same procedure now for the mandibular cast while we're waiting on that wax to harden. By again taking a sheet of base plate wax, soften it in the open flame, very nice and pliable. And once it's softened, then we want to get one area of it 1 inch or 2 long on one end of it with a molten surface folded over on itself. Then we're going to again get a molten surface and keep folding it over on itself until we can roll the material. And we're going to roll it into a molten surface like we did on the maxillary, and just keep rolling it into that molten surface until we have formed a cylinder out of the material, or a hot dog shape as I call it. Start again by molten surface on the underneath side and start at the midline. And on the mandibular, we want that labial surface to be virtually vertical from the labial periphery. Not leaning out or in, but just vertical from the labial periphery, and then work it back posteriorly, both buccal and lingual, all the way down to the periphery. Do the same on the other side, and work it down until it's all the way down to the periphery, both buccal and lingual. And when we're finished with this, we would like the labial surface to be vertical from the edge of the labial periphery. That's in just a little bit, so we're going to work it out to an arch form that will allow that to be vertical right here. And we would like it to be directly over the crest of the ridge here and here. So work it. Generally, that crest of the ridge is a little bit farther lingual than what you realize it is. So work the material, and while it's still soft, let's tease that base plate off and look at it and see how close we are to the crest of the ridge. If we can see here, we see the crest of the ridge, and the center of this occlusion rim posteriorly should be directly over the crest of the ridge. And we can look on the other side, the same thing, look at the crest of the ridge, and then we should see that the center of this wax is directly over the crest of the ridge. Then we can put it back onto the master cast. Take our wax spatula, superheat the wax spatula again to sear it in, just as we did on the maxillary arch. And we're going to sear it in and smooth it as we do that. Smooth the facial surfaces of it and sear it in to the base plate so it will adhere to it well. Any defects in it, just flow some wax into it and that will work fine. Do the same thing on the lingual surface with a hot spatula. Sear it in and smooth it as you go. Until we have smoothed and seared in all of those facial and lingual surfaces. It's nice and smooth. Once you have it smooth, then take a knife again, and we're going to cut off a wedge to form a notch between the distal of the occlusion rim and the retromolar pad coverage. And we would like that notch to come forward at about a 45-degree angle, starting from the anterior edge of the retromolar pad, which is right here, and come forward at about a 45-degree angle, forming a notch just anterior to and over the retromolar pad. And we do that on both sides so that we have this notch that is formed here over both sides. We can get rid of any of this little excess wax that's flowed out over your cast if you want to at this point. But the main thing we want to do while we have it in this state now is, again, like we did on the maxillary, is to take our hot plate, heat it up very nice and warm, nice and hot, so it can shape the wax for us. And we're going to smooth off the occlusal surface of that maxillary and get the occlusal surface nice and flat. Get it nice and flat and virtually parallel to the crest of the ridge of the anterior part of the crest of the ridge. The height of a mandibular occlusion rim, I usually start with it with the height of it emanating from about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way up the retromolar pad. As you can see here, this height now will be part way up almost to the top of the retromolar pad. And then let it just come straight forward parallel to the base of your cast from there. And if you have made your cast properly, like we talked about, to the crest of the ridge is parallel to the base of the cast, then this surface will be parallel to the crest of the ridge on the cast at about the height of 2/3 to 3/4 of the way up the retromolar pad on each side. I know in the textbook and in our preclinical courses we have told you to make this length from the edge of the periphery and the labial here to the incisal edge to be 18 millimeters on the lower and 22 millimeters on the maxillary. That is minimum height. You want it at least 18 millimeters high in this area on the mandibular, and on the maxillary, the same thing on the maxillary. You want this to be from the edge of the periphery, which is basically in the lateral region, and right in this area. From this area to the incisal edge, you would like that to be at least 22 millimeters long. That will pretty well assure you when you go to the mouth that you have enough wax till when you get to the mouth you have too much wax rather than not enough. One of the disheartening things is to get to your patient with these and you find that they're too short. It's a lot more work in the patient's mouth with the patient sitting there to add to the length of this than it is to take it off. So always start with them a little bit too long, okay? If you're going to cheat on the 22 millimeters at all, make it much longer than 22 millimeters. Don't ever make it shorter than the 22 millimeters. I haven't measured these. After a bit, you get to where you look at them and say, yeah, that's about right. After this wax is set a bit now, and we've set it aside and allowed that wax to cool, At this point, we're ready to tease these back from the master cast, tease them off the master cast, and to smooth them by taking a knife and getting rid of any excess material that's down at the periphery where that wax has flowed down close to the periphery, and it'll be sort of rough. So you can take a knife and get rid of the roughness of that by cutting that excess off, any of that wax that has run down around the periphery. Just smooth it up so it's real nice and smooth. And once you do that, then look and see if you have any rough places on your wax that you would like to carve off of it. Like right there is a little pool of wax that would end up just sort of looking rough. So we can get rid of that. See if there's any other roughened areas on it. Then we can put it back onto our master cast, make sure it still fits that master cast well. And with our hand-out torch and a nice pinpoint flame, and we can smooth that wax with a pinpoint flame just by brushing it with a pinpoint flame to make it very nice and smooth and presentable, so that when we take this to our patient, it looks very presentable, and it's very impressive to the patient that these things look smooth and look clean. It's very disheartening to take these to your patient and they're dirty looking or rough. They should be very nice and smooth and clean. Any pooling of wax that you get as you flame that, and just get rid of the extra wax and a very slight bit of flaming. And that's basically what that maxillary should look like when we're finished with it. Now let's do the same thing with the mandibular base plate and occlusion rim. We'll tease it off of the master cast. And now we're going to get rid of any excess that's flowed down around the periphery, and just take a knife and carve it off of there and get rid of any roughness that might be on it. And any wax that's flowed up underneath it or down onto the periphery, get rid of that. Smooth this wax like so. There's a little bit of excess wax here on the mandibular, on the lingual of it. A little more than I usually get with it, but that's okay. We just carve it off there and just make sure it's nice and smooth. Get rid of all the excess wax. Any rough areas, such as here and here, try to carve those. Get rid of as much of the roughness as you can. Then we place it back onto our master cast again. Make sure it's well seated. And take our pinpoint flame and just brush it with a pinpoint flame. I don't know where the soot's coming from, but I'm getting some soot into this. And I'll need to clean that back up after this wax set. See that? So we'll need to clean that back out before we actually take it to the patient. We have one void right there. So I want to take a wax spatula and a little wax. There's always a little scrap wax laying around on the table where you've been working with this. So we take a little scrap wax and we're going to flow it into that area where we have that void, just to patch that in with a little wax and smooth it out. Now we can set these aside now, allow them to totally cool, and when our patient comes in, we'll be ready to start the procedure known as jaw relations.